The morning started like any other in downtown Atlanta. Sirens echoing faintly in the distance, the smell of coffee and rain mixing in the cool autumn air. Streets shimmered with reflections from neon signs and early commuters, their footsteps echoing softly between brick buildings. The city seemed half awake, stretching into another day of endless routines. But within moments, that calm rhythm would shatter. What began as an ordinary morning, a quiet corner, a cup of coffee, a passerby waiting for the light to change, would soon ignite a storm. A simple misunderstanding, born from perception and prejudice, would unravel into a moment that forced an entire city to look in the mirror. On the corner of Peachtree and 10th, a woman in a purple hoodie stood still, sipping her drink, lost in thought. Her presence was calm, ordinary, yet somehow, to the two officers rolling slowly past in a patrol car, it was enough to draw suspicion. Their glances hardened. The tension in the air thickened, invisible but unmistakable. Within seconds, the silence of morning turned brittle. The first officer opened his door, the echo of metal slamming against the humid air. Conversations nearby stopped. Coffee cups froze midair. No one knew who she was, and not yet. But what was about to unfold would flip every assumption, every stereotype, every unspoken bias on its head. Alicia Monroe had built her life on discipline, integrity, and the belief that justice could be fair. From her first day as a rookie officer, she'd carried an unshakable conviction that the badge was more than a symbol of authority. It was a promise. Over the years, she climbed through the ranks, patrol duty, detective work, special investigations, and finally, captain, the first black woman in her city's history to wear that title. But this morning, she wasn't Captain Monroe. She wasn't the name etched on the department's wall of honor or the voice leading community reform meetings. She was just Alicia, a woman in running shoes, a hoodie, and sweatpants. Carrying a coffee cup after an early jog, she'd spent decades studying community relations, rebuilding trust where it had been broken, standing before crowds who had stopped believing that fairness still existed. She'd been the one to reassure mothers, to meet with grieving families, to say, "We're trying to change," yet the cruel irony wasn't lost on her later, that even after all she'd achieved, even with her badge resting in her pocket, her skin color still spoke first. As she waited to cross the street, the patrol car beside her rolled to a stop. Two officers inside, young, fresh-faced, maybe only a few years into service, looked her way. Their expressions shifted from indifference to scrutiny. One leaned forward, tapping his partner's arm. Within seconds, the door opened. The sound was slight, but to Alicia, it was deafening. She turned slightly, steadying her breath. She had trained officers like them, taught them to observe before assuming, to de-escalate before demanding. But the tension in their eyes told her this wasn't training anymore. "Morning," she said softly, though her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had worn the badge far longer than they had. The officer didn't reply. Instead, his questions came sharp, clipped, pointed. Where was she headed? Why was she there? Did she live nearby? Alicia answered each one with measured patience, her words chosen with care. But inside, she recognized the script. She'd read it 100 times in reports, the same tone that turned routine interactions into flashpoints. The crowd began to notice. A man on the opposite sidewalk slowed, pulling out his phone. The faint hum of traffic seemed to vanish beneath the static of the officer's radio. His partner shifted nervously, glancing between them. Alicia's heart pounded, but not from fear, from frustration. She wanted to say, "I'm one of you." She tried to pull out her badge immediately, to end this farce before it spiraled. But another voice, the seasoned officer in her, whispered restraint. She knew that anger could twist perception, that one wrong move could be misread forever. So she breathed, deeply, slowly. Her mind replayed every workshop she'd ever led, every training session where she'd said, "Remember, treat people as human beings first." Yet here she was, reduced to suspicion by the very system she'd helped build. The officer's tone tightened. He stepped closer, posture stiff, hand grazing his belt. The second officer shifted uneasily. People began murmuring, their voices low and uneasy. A small child, holding his mother's hand, looked up and whispered, "Why are they talking to her like that?" And in that moment, Alicia saw more than just two officers. She saw a reflection of hundreds of cases she'd reviewed, names she'd memorized from news headlines, faces she'd never forget, citizens who hadn't been believed, whose truth had come too late. Her pulse steadied. She exhaled, calm, deliberate. She reached into her pocket. The first officer tensed, a spark of alarm flashing in his eyes. The man recording gasped. But what emerged wasn't a threat. It was a badge. The silver emblem glinted in the sunlight as she raised it, unwavering. The street fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. The younger officer blinked, confusion shifting into disbelief. His partner's posture melted from authority to shock. "Captain A. Monroe," the badge read. No words came. Alicia didn't need them. Her eyes spoke volumes, and not with fury, but with the quiet power of disappointment. The kind that strips away pretense and leaves only truth behind. Phones continued recording. Witnesses whispered in awe. The officers looked at each other, their faces pale, unsure how to move, how to recover. For years, Alicia had taught recruits about implicit bias, how the mind fills blanks with stereotypes before facts ever arrive. Now she stood as living proof of that lesson. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and resonant, echoing across the still street. She didn't accuse. She reminded. She spoke of accountability, of how every badge carried not just the right to act, but the duty to reflect. That, without empathy, authority was hollow. The crowd began to clap softly, the sound spreading like a wave. Not out of mockery, but admiration. The two officers lowered their heads. The tension dissipated into quiet understanding, heavy and humbling. That single moment, recorded, replayed, and shared, would ripple far beyond that intersection. By afternoon, the video had swept across social media. Millions watched, debated, and learned. Some saw another example of bias. Others saw grace under pressure. Alicia saw an opportunity, a turning point that could spark something greater than outrage: education. The department launched an internal review. Not a witch hunt, but a mirror. Training modules were rewritten. Supervisors began mandating empathy workshops. Alicia spoke publicly, not as a victim, but as a leader determined to turn embarrassment into enlightenment. Her story traveled beyond the city. Universities invited her to speak. Civil organizations shared her message. She emphasized not what went wrong, but what could go right. If people listened before judging, paused before assuming. Months later, during a training session, one of the same officers from that day approached her. His voice trembled as he spoke, sincere, uneasy. He thanked her, not for forgiving him, but for showing him what he couldn't see before. Alicia listened, nodded, and smiled, not out of pride, but out of hope. Because she knew change rarely comes from policy alone. It comes from people who've been humbled enough to grow. That morning had started like any other, with rain, coffee, and routine. But it had ended with something else entirely: reflection. And maybe that's the lesson that endures, that justice isn't measured by the power we hold, but by the courage to question how we use it. Because sometimes, the strongest statement isn't shouted in anger, it's shown in grace.